Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In our first season, we talked with Linda Zagzebski about 3 different solutions to the problem of free will and divine foreknowledge. In this episode, we talked with Andrew Law about a different solution, what has come to be known as the dependent solution to the problem of free will and divine foreknowledge.
Thanks for listening. Well, I'm happy to introduce Andrew Law, who's currently a lecturer in philosophy at Western Washington University. Andrew recently completed his PhD in philosophy at the University of California, Riverside, where he and I overlapped for several years. Andrew's published several papers on free will and moral responsibility, including a recent paper in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy on what indeterminism offers to agency, which may be of interest to some of our listeners, and I'd recommend checking out. Today, we'll focus on some work he's done recently on a view on divine foreknowledge and free will. That'll be the focus of today's episode. So welcome to the show, Andrew. Can you start by telling us and our audience a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on free will?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say thanks so much for having me on. I think this podcast is awesome, so I'm really excited to be here. But yeah, as you mentioned, My name's Andrew Law. I'm a lecturer in the philosophy department at Western. I suppose I first got interested in issues about free will back in high school when I was thinking about the relationship between God and free will in particular. You know, I was taught growing up, like many of us, that there's an all-powerful, all-knowing God, one who is ultimately in control of everything that happens in the universe, has a plan for each one of us, so on and so forth. And I think it's just natural to wonder, how does free will fit into that picture? And there are a few different puzzles there, but the puzzle I ended up focusing on in my graduate school and such is the puzzle of freedom and foreknowledge, which is this puzzle goes back 2,000 years or so about if God knows and has always known every decision we're ever going to make, every choice, every action well in advance. Well, how could it be that we have free will, right? Are we ever free to decide differently than what we actually decide? And I've changed my mind a few times about that puzzle over the years, to be honest. But lately, at least, I've kind of settled on the so-called dependent solution. And so a lot of my work is devoted to developing and defending that particular solution to the puzzle of freedom and foreknowledge. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, very cool. When the first season of our podcast, we interviewed Linda Zagzebski about this same problem, divine foreknowledge and human free will. So if listeners are interested in the details of that conversation, they can go check out the earlier episode. But would you mind taking us through a version of the argument for the conclusion that foreknowledge and free will are incompatible?
Yeah, sure. So there are a few different versions. I think one of the most compelling versions goes like this. So suppose, just for the sake of argument, that God knows and has always known the future in its entirety. Well, that means that, say, 1,000 years ago, God knew, and hence believed, since knowledge requires belief, that we were going to have this conversation today. And let's just suppose, again, for the sake of argument, that our conversation is going to last roughly an hour. Well, then 1,000 years ago, God knew about that too. Well, the first premise of the argument just says we don't have any say over what God believed long ago. Or in particular, we don't have a choice about the fact that 1,000 years ago, God believed that our conversation would last an hour today. And this is supposed to be because, the past is over and done with. It's settled. It's beyond our control. It's, quote, fixed, as philosophers sometimes say. Mm-hmm. And so this first premise just looks eminently plausible. But then the second premise just points out that, well, if God believes that something's going to happen, it's going to happen. It's guaranteed, right? There's no way around it. And this is one big difference between us and God. I mean, there are many big differences, but this is one of them where, we can believe whatever we want about the future. Maybe we even get it right on certain occasions. But of course, there's no guarantee that we're going to get things right. We make mistakes all the time. It's perfectly possible for us to be mistaken. We are said to be fallible creatures, that is. Well, God traditionally is held to be an infallible being, that God never makes mistakes. In fact, it's not even possible for God to make a mistake. And so that just means that, the second premise, which if we're being a little bit more careful, I guess we should put it this way, that necessarily, if 1,000 years ago, God believed that our conversation is going to last an hour today, well, then our conversation is going to last an hour today. And so the second premise also looks really, really plausible. Well, now you look at those two premises. Okay, we don't have a choice about what God believed long ago. We don't have the choice about the fact that 1,000 years ago God believed our conversation would last an hour today. Now that second premise, which says necessarily if God believed that was going to happen, then it's going to happen. Well, it's just natural to conclude that, well, our conversation is going to last an hour today, and we don't have a choice about that fact either. And this kind of reasoning sometimes gets called transfer of powerlessness type reasoning. And just in a general form, it goes like this. It says, if you don't have a choice about X, and X guarantees or necessitates Y, well, then you don't have a choice about Y either. And this kind of reasoning, it is somewhat controversial in philosophy, but I think there's something very natural to it. We seem to use something like it in our ordinary lives. So just as a simple example, suppose you're at the bus stop one day waiting for the bus on your way to class, and you learn that it's going to be late. And so you wait around a few more minutes, and then you learn it's going to be really, really late. There's a bunch of road closures or something. And so now you're looking at the bus schedule, and of course there's nothing you can do about the fact that the bus is going to be so late, right? That's not under your control. But suppose, given your circumstances, that with the bus running as late as it is, it's virtually guaranteed that you're going to be late to class, right? Yeah, you could get an Uber or call a friend or something, but all of these methods are going to take some extra time, and you just don't have any time at this point. Well, if that's the situation you find yourself in, right? The bus is late, there's nothing you can do about it. That basically guarantees you're going to be late to class. It seems like you should just accept the fact that you're going to be late to class, and again, there's not really nothing you can do about it. That's the same kind of reasoning behind this foreknowledge argument. We don't have any choice about what God believed long ago, but if God has foreknowledge of the future, well, then those beliefs guarantee or necessitate that we act in certain ways and not others. So it's natural to conclude that we're just going to act as we do and not in any other way. We don't have a choice about that. So that's a brief recap of the argument.
Thanks. So now your view is that the best response to this sort of argument appeals to the notion of dependence. So could you say a little bit about the basic idea of the dependence response?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just start by saying that argument I just gave, I really do find it a compelling argument. I think it's really, really powerful. Some philosophers kind of poo-poo it and say, there's some obvious flaw here or something, but that's not me. I think it's a really, really serious argument. So serious that I even accepted it for a number of years. I thought, this just proves that foreknowledge and freedom are incompatible. Mm-hmm. But then I stumbled across the dependence solution, and now I've changed my tune a little bit. So the dependent solution has its contemporary origins or contemporary genesis in a work by Trenton Merrick's called Truth and Freedom, which came out a little bit over a decade ago. Arguably, it goes back to Origen, who was an early church father writing in the 2nd century. It's just worth quoting him here. He puts it this way. He says, quote, "Even if we should conceive of foreknowledge according to the popular understanding, it will not be because God knows that an event will occur, that it happens, but because something is going to take place, it is known by God before it happens." Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but I think we can simplify it a bit. And the basic idea is just this. Our choices don't depend on what God believed long ago. Rather, what God believed long ago depends on our choices. And where the dependence there, I think that Origen has in mind is that the because talk, right? So it's not that we do what we do because God believed we would do it. Rather, God believed we would do it because we end up making the choices we do. So I think that's the basic idea of the dependence solution. Mm-hmm. So there are two claims there. And I think the first claim is really uncontroversial. I think it's at least not nearly as controversial as the second claim. So maybe we could just talk through those claims really quickly. So the first claim says that our choices don't depend on what God believed long ago. I think what Origen's after here, he's thinking that there's a difference between knowing that something's going to happen and making it happen. Mm-hmm. So maybe I know what time the sun is going to rise tomorrow, but of course I don't make the sun rise at the time it does tomorrow. Same thing with human action, right? I might know how somebody's going to act in a certain situation, but of course that doesn't necessarily mean I make them act that way. Mm-hmm. I think Origen's thinking something similar could be said about God, that even if God 1,000 years ago knew that we were going to have this conversation today, that it's going to last an hour, that doesn't necessarily mean God made us have this conversation. If God decreed that we have this conversation, that would be different, right? If 1,000 years ago, God said, just like God said, let there be light, God said, let it be the case that Andrew, Matt, and Taylor have a conversation about foreknowledge the last an hour. Well, then, that would be God making us have this conversation. Yeah. But just knowing that it's going to happen, that seems God doesn't necessarily make it happen. So that's the first claim. And again, I think that's going to be a pretty plausible claim. I think a lot of philosophers are going to be okay with that first claim. The second claim, though, is the controversial one. That one says that actually God's past beliefs depend on our choices, that if we follow with this kind of explanatory talk, the idea is that if you want to know why it was 1,000 years ago that God believed we would have this conversation, that it would last an hour, well, it's actually because we decided to have this conversation, and because we're going to decide to have it last an hour. Now, that's, I think, a pretty bizarre claim when you first hear it. You think about this kind of backwards explanation, part of the past being explained by something we're doing now here in the present and in the future. That's strange. But I think how plausible it is, it's going to really depend ultimately on how foreknowledge works. So let me just give you one model of foreknowledge that I think would vindicate Origen's second claim here. You might call it the time telescope model. And it goes like this. So we have telescopes, and one thing that's so cool about telescopes is they give us access to distant places, places we otherwise wouldn't be able to have access to. So maybe one morning you wake up and you're wondering, what does Jupiter look like today? And so you point your telescope out at Jupiter and you see, the red eye, it's still swirling, it's still going strong. Well, some people have thought, what if God has something like a time telescope, a telescope that gives him not access to distant places, but instead distant times? Then the idea would be 1,000 years ago, God's wondering what, are Andrew and Matt and Taylor, what are they going to be doing in 1,000 years from today? God pulls out his time telescope, peers into the future, and he sees us having this conversation, and he sees that it lasts about an hour. And on that basis forms the belief that, okay, in 1,000 years ago, 1,000 years from now, Andrew, Matt, and Taylor will be having a conversation, one about foreknowledge, quite fittingly, and it's going to last about an hour. Now, of course, this is just a metaphor. No one really thinks about God as like sitting out somewhere in the universe with a time telescope. But I think more literal truth would be something like this, that God, again, in contrast to us mere humans, God has access to all times. We have access to the present, and we can remember the past, we can anticipate the future, but it's really only the present that we actually have direct access to. Some people have thought about God very differently, where God has access, unmediated access to past, present, and future all equally. If that's true, then I think something like the time telescope model is kind of a nice imaginative version of this particular model of foreknowledge, where, again, 1,000 years ago, the only reason God believed that we would be having this conversation today is because he looked into the future and he saw us having this conversation. And of course, he only saw that because we decided to have this conversation. So I think, again, if the time telescope model, something like it, is correct, then this second claim of Origen's, that actually God's past beliefs depend on our current choices, I think that second claim makes good sense.
Yeah.
Nice. Good. So could you say just a little bit more about how the response is supposed to address the argument that you sketched earlier? Like, what's the basic idea, and like which premise will the dependence response deny?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, this is more or less the kind of question I had when I first came across the dependence solution. I thought, okay, Origin, cool. Maybe I agree with you. Who knows? But so what? How does this help with freedom and foreknowledge? It just seems orthogonal to the debate.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in Origin, he doesn't have a whole lot to say here. And in his defense, he's writing long before these arguments had really been crystallized. Mm-hmm. But I think he must have had a couple different principles about agency in the back of his mind. Maybe the first and foremost being what you might call the, quote, downstream dependence principle. That's just a name I made up. But the downstream dependence principle in its general form says this: if you have a choice about X and Y depends on X, well, then you have a choice, at least to some extent, about Y as well. So just a simple example to illustrate the principle. Suppose one day you're at home and you're thinking about whether to eat the last slice of cake or not. It's been a long day. You're really late to class and your professor chewed you out and stuff. So I need a little pick-me-up, and that last slice of cake, that'll do it. But you know that it's pretty late, and if you eat that last slice of cake, you're not going to sleep all that well, or too much sugar and all that. Well, if that's your situation, it seems like, okay, you've got a choice about whether you eat the last slice of cake, and how well you sleep depends on whether you eat the last slice of cake. The downstream dependence principle implies that, well, that means you have a choice to some extent over how well you sleep tonight. And that seems like the right result. So again, I think the downstream dependence principle, it's a pretty intuitive principle. But if you combine it with Origen's claims, then we get a really interesting response to the argument for the incompatibility of foreknowledge and freedom. Because if we just bracket for a second the issue of whether foreknowledge and freedom are compatible, right? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, we don't know. Let's just bracket it for a second. It sure seems like we have choices, that we had a choice about whether to have this conversation today. We have a choice over how long it's going to last, those kinds of things. And if Origen's right, then what God believed long ago depends on our choices. And so the downstream dependence principle implies that we therefore have a choice, at least to some extent, over what God believed long ago. So in particular, that first premise of the argument, which says we don't have a choice about the fact that 1,000 years ago God believed our conversation would last an hour today, I think the dependence solution denies that, says, no, we actually do have a choice about it, or at the very least, we haven't been given a sufficient reason to accept that first premise is true. So that's how I think of the dependence solution interacting with the argument for the incompatibility.
Gotcha.
Yeah. One thing that Zagzebski talked about was the idea that the past is over and done with. And it seems because of this that it's out of our control. And the analogy that is brought up in this kind of discussion is there's no use crying over spilled milk. Like the past is over and done with. We can't do anything about it. So this kind of response to the freedom and foreknowledge argument seems to deny the fixity of the past. So how can it be that we have a choice over something that's in the past?
Yeah, excellent question. And I'll be the first to admit that this claim that we have a choice about what God believed in the distant past, right? That just seems extremely counterintuitive when you first hear it. And yeah, so this is kind of the most obvious challenge in some ways to the dependent solution. But I think what Origen should say here, or at least what I want to say is, yes, absolutely. In ordinary circumstances, the past is beyond our control. It's over and done with. No use crying over spilled milk and all that. But that's precisely because in ordinary circumstances, the past in no way depends on any of our choices. That, maybe whether I eat the last slice of cake or not, that explains how well I sleep tonight. But it's not going to explain how well I slept last night. That doesn't make any sense, right, in your typical ordinary circumstance.
Right.
But if that's the reason why the past is beyond our control, because it ordinarily doesn't depend on our choices, well, that implies that if there were some extraordinary, bizarre, strange circumstance where somehow the past did depend on some of our choices, well, then we should be more open to the idea that maybe we do have a choice about that part of the past at least. And this idea that the past is beyond our control, generally speaking, because generally speaking, the past is independent of our choices, I think this is actually a really powerful idea. I think it can explain a whole host of cases. But let me just give you one fun and kind of dramatic case, and that's the case of time travel. So who knows whether time travel is possible or not? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But just you don't really need time travel to be possible to appreciate the case, but it's more fun if you think it is possible. So let's just pretend time travel is possible for a second. And suppose when you've been a lifelong NFL fan, and so nothing would make you happier than to go and watch the first Super Bowl in person. But of course, that happened a long time ago. You don't have a choice about that anymore, right? It's not an option for you. But then one day, your super smart, Nobel Prize-winning physicist neighbor knocks on your door with this strange contraption in her arms. And she says, hey, I've heard you've been kind of down in the dumps lately. The professor chewed you out for being late the other day. And you ate too much cake the other night. You haven't been sleeping very well. You could really use a pick-me-up. So I thought I'd let you use my time machine. I know. You probably don't believe me, but trust me, I can walk you through all the math. I can show you pictures of me with Abraham Lincoln and Cleopatra. It really is a working time machine. And all you have to do, I've set everything up. You just have to push the button here. It'll take you back to the first Super Bowl. I know how much joy that would bring you. So I'll leave you here to decide whether you want to use it or not. And then she walks out the door and leaves the contraption with you. Well, the thought is, it sure seems like you have a choice over whether you push the button or not. That's up to you, right? All you got to do is extend your arm and push the button. That's something surely you can do. And if it really is a working time machine, then whether or not you attend the first Super Bowl, it depends on whether you push the button. And so the downstream dependence principle would imply that you have a choice to some extent over whether you attend the first Super Bowl or not, now that you have a working time machine. And I think that's actually a pretty intuitive result, right? I mean, one of the reasons time travel would be so cool is because it would open up all kinds of possibilities for us, possibilities that we normally wouldn't even consider, like watching the first Super Bowl. if time travel were possible, if we had time machines, then there'd be lots more options available to us in terms of what we would be able to do. It seems like we would have some kind of power over the past. And that's exactly what the dependent solution delivers. So, yeah, I think at first it's counterintuitive to think of as the past as depending on any of our choices. But once you think through why it is the past is ordinarily or typically beyond our control, I think it's actually intuitive to think of those parts of the past that depend, if there are any parts that depend on our choices, as those parts being parts of the past that we do have some say over.
Yeah. Before we get to the objections, can I ask a follow-up question? So one of the responses that we covered when we talked about this in the first season was the alchemist response, and they make a distinction between different kinds of past facts. So could you say a little bit about what makes the dependence view different from the alchemist view?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do think if you want to, you can construe the dependent solution as one version of alchemism. So alchemism, right, the central idea of the alchemist response is there's a distinction between so-called hard facts about the past and soft facts about the past. So here's a hard fact about the past. John F. Kennedy was assassinated 59 years ago, right? 1963 is 2022. So it's been 59 years. That's a hard fact about the past because it's solely concerned with the past, as it were. It's solely concerned with what happened 59 years ago in this case. And sure enough, it seems like there's nothing we can do about that. We can't prevent JFK from being assassinated back then. Here's a soft fact about the past, though. JFK was assassinated 59 years prior to us having this hour-long conversation. Let's suppose that's a fact, actually, because suppose we're going to have an hour-long conversation. So it is true that JFK was assassinated 59 years prior to this hour-long conversation. But it seems like it's very different than the fact about JFK being assassinated 59 years ago, because it's kind of temporally relational fact. It partly involves the past, JFK's assassination, but also partly involves the future, right, the rest of this conversation. And so it's very different than that hard fact. And sure enough, it seems like we have some control over that soft fact about the past. We could decide to stop this conversation right now, and it wouldn't be true that JFK was assassinated 59 years prior to this hour-long conversation. So that's the central idea of alchemism, right? That there's a difference between hard facts and soft facts, and God's beliefs or facts about God's past beliefs. The alchemists will hold that are soft facts about the past. Now, if you want to, you can construe the dependent solution as a variety of alchemism if you think that the best way to distinguish hard facts from soft facts is in terms of dependence. If you think that a hard fact about the past just is a fact that's in no way dependent on our current choices or future choices, well then, yeah, the dependent solution is going to count as a variety of alchemism. I think it's going to be a far superior version of alchemism than's kind of been previously offered. And that's because the previous ways of distinguishing hard facts and soft facts have not been all that satisfactory. And in particular, it's really hard to get a plausible way of distinguishing the two in such a way that facts about God's past beliefs are definitely going to count as soft facts about the past. So I think if you want to, you can think of the dependent solution as a variety of alchemism, and you're going to get a better version of alchemism. But I personally think of it as a different kind of solution. And that's because when I'm given the clear paradigm examples of soft facts and hard facts, it seems to me like the temporal relationality, that's doing more work than the idea of dependence. And so for me, I just think facts about what God believed long ago, those are definitely hard facts about the past because they're kind of solely concerned with what kind of God's mind, as it were. It's hard for me to see why, say, the fact that Aquinas, say 1,000 years ago, believed that we would be having this conversation today, why that would count as a hard fact, but the fact that God believed 1,000 years ago that we'd be having this conversation today would count as a soft fact. It seems like we should treat those on a par. So even if there's the difference in dependence relations, it seems like they should still both count as hard facts. So what I'm inclined to think is instead, the dependent solution is a version of what's sometimes called multiple pasts compatibilism, which according to multiple past compatibilism, not even hard facts about the past are necessarily fixed. Instead, it's only a certain subset of the hard facts about the past that are fixed, which subset, according to the dependent solution, is going to be those facts about the past that are completely independent of our present choices. One reason to prefer thinking about the dependent solution as a multiple pasts compatibilist solution is you can avoid a certain kind of puzzle that comes up on the alchemist proposal. And here's the puzzle for the alchemist: is they want to say every hard fact about the past is fixed, but not every soft fact about the past is fixed. But it sure seems like there are some soft facts about the past that we don't have any control over. So, for instance, it was true yesterday that the sun would be rising, a week from then. That's a soft fact about the past. At least it sure seems to be a soft fact about the past, but it's a soft fact that we don't have any control over whatsoever. Right? We're not going to be able to prevent the sun from rising, when it does. And so the alchemist has this puzzle on their hands where even if even if facts about God's past beliefs count as soft facts about the past, there's not a guarantee that we have any control over them, because they might end up being more like the soft fact about the sun's rising. But on the multiple past version, you don't have that similar puzzle. In fact, you can explain the difference there, because why was it true yesterday that the sun would be rising, in a week? Well, that in no way depends on any of our choices, right? That's in no way explained by anything we do. But the fact that, 59 years ago, JFK was assassinated 59 years prior to us having this hour-long conversation, that is explained by our current choices. And so if you think of the dependent solution as the more fundamental idea, you can actually sort through this kind of puzzle that arises on the alchemist picture.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, thanks for talking through that. That connects up with what we were talking with in season 1 with Zygzebski. We talked about alchemism and a couple other responses, but we hadn't gotten into the dependence response. So it's nice to contrast that with something we already talked about. Well, let's move to some objections. What do you think, kind of just generally, are some of the main challenges for the dependence response?
Yeah. The dependent solution, it's a relative newcomer to the contemporary scene, as I mentioned. So there's not really a host of standard objections yet. But I think it's helpful to divide the objections into 2 categories. The first category consists of objections to Origen's particular claims about the relationship between God's past beliefs and our choices. So you might have lots of reasons to doubt the Origen's claims here. You might think, for one, the kind of backward explanation or backward dependence we've been talking about, that's just absolutely impossible. So it's going to be impossible for God's past beliefs to depend on our choices. You might also think that, sure, maybe backwards dependence in principle is possible, but it just doesn't work in the foreknowledge case. That, say, the time telescope model is just incoherent. And so even if backward explanation or backward dependence is possible, it's not going to help solve the problem of freedom and foreknowledge. You might also have theological reasons for denying Origen's claims here. For instance, you might accept a certain version of the doctrine of divine aseity, according to which, very roughly, God is wholly independent of creation. Well, if God's wholly independent of creation, you might think that's incompatible with this idea that God's past beliefs somehow depend on our choices. So that's a kind of a sample of the first category of objection, where we're going after Origen's particular claims about the relationship between God's past beliefs and our choices. That's an important category of objection, but I actually think the second category is more interesting. And the second category consists of objections to the more general principles of agency that Origen seemed to have had in the back of his mind, principles like the downstream dependence principle. And I guess the reason I find these objections more interesting is because these principles that Origen seems to have had in the back of his mind, they're meant to apply not just to the case of foreknowledge, but also they could apply in principle to lots of other issues about freedom. So you might be able to apply them to the issues of causal determinism in freedom, or logical fatalism in freedom. And so thinking through these more general principles, I think, is a really promising avenue for discovering more about the nature of free will. So in the second category, just give you a couple examples. One is, you might worry about the grandfather paradox, right? If we're already talking about time travel, then we got to talk about the grandfather paradox. And it seems like you might think that the grandfather paradox presents a counterexample to the downstream dependence principle, or at least the downstream dependence principle is not going to deliver the intuitive result. Another time travel objection actually comes from one of the hosts of this podcast, Taylor Sear. It's a brand new objection. It's like hot off the press. It's another time travel case where, it seems like a time traveler could know the future with certainty, what's going to happen, and so not be nervous at all about what's going to happen. And yet, if the dependent solution is right, then still, even if the time traveler knows what's going to happen, the individuals concerned are still going to be free. They're going to be able to do otherwise. It'll be possible for them to do otherwise. Well, then how could the time traveler not be nervous whatsoever about what's going to happen, given they acknowledge that there's a real possibility things go differently than what they think is, than how they imagine? So those are a couple different objections. Again, time travel objections. There are a few other ones. Patrick Todd gives one from the case of divine pre-punishment, where God pre-punishes somebody in advance based on what they're going to do. It seems like if the dependent solution is correct, then the person is still able to avoid doing the bad thing, so able to avoid the pre-punishment. That seems really counterintuitive. So anyways, those are just a few examples of objections in that second category.
Nice. I should mention my case is modeled after one from Patrick Todd in a different debate about free will, but the whole idea of non-nervousness I took from him. But yeah, those are good objections to mention. Could you say a little bit more about at least the grandfather paradox one, what the grandfather paradox is and why that someone might take that to be a counterexample to the dependence response?
Yeah. So the grandfather paradox, let's maybe we can continue our story here. So you go back and you watch the first Super Bowl and you're like, that was so much fun. This time travel business, really, really cool. What else should I do before I head back to the future? And you think, you know what I've always wanted to do is kill my grandfather. That guy was just a jerk. I don't know. Maybe he was a war criminal, we can say, and he never got caught. Yeah. And he was just terrible to my family. And he's just one of those individuals. The world would be a better place if he had just been, killed as a young man or something. And so you go back to a time when he was a young man and you approach him on the street with a gun in your hand and hatred in your heart, as David Lewis would say.
Yeah.
So here you are standing on the street. You're pointing your gun right at grandfather, from 10 feet away, we can say. Can you kill grandfather? And I think the intuitive answer is, well, no, of course not, right? Because if you killed grandfather, then he would never meet grandmother, which means your mother would never be born, which means you would never be born, which means you wouldn't go back to kill him in the first place. We just get all these contradictions. Seems like, no, you cannot kill grandfather. That's not something you really have a choice about. But you might think the downstream dependence principle gets the wrong result here, because it sure seems like you have a choice over whether you pull the trigger, say, right? All you got to do is move your finger a little bit. And given the circumstances, it looks like whether grandfather lives or dies depends on whether you pull the trigger. And so the downstream dependence principle implies that you've got a choice about whether grandfather lives or dies, which is just exactly the wrong result. So that looks like a potential counterexample to the downstream dependence principle. And so that would obviously undermine the dependence solution, at least as I conceive of it. I do think there's a nice response here, though, from Origen. Origen obviously wasn't thinking about time travel. Right? People didn't think about time travel until like the 18th, 19th century. So Origen definitely wasn't thinking about it. But it's kind of cool that I think some of his comments suggest a possible solution, because if we recall that first claim of Origen's comments, the first claim says that our choices don't depend on God's past beliefs. Well, Origen must have had some more general principle in mind, if that's going to be relevant. Or he must have been thinking that if our choices somehow did depend on God's past beliefs, well, that would be a problem. Mm-hmm. And so the more general principle seems to be this. It's what I call the upstream dependence principle. And it says, if you're faced with some decision about X, say at time T, but you're only faced with that decision because Y happened or Y will happen or Y occurred or Y is true. Well, then when you're facing that decision about X at time T, you no longer have a choice about Y. You don't have a choice about Y at T. Or just more cleanly, if you have a decision about X at time T, but you're having a decision at time T depends on Y, well, then at time T, you don't have a choice about Y. So let me just give you another simple example. So let's go back to the cake example where you're thinking about eating the cake or not. And let's say you do eat the last slice of cake. You're like, yep, it's worth it. I don't care if I don't sleep all that well. I'm going to eat the last slice of cake. And then shortly after you do, your partner comes home and they look in the fridge and they think, did you eat that? Sorry, I keep messing up.
That's all right.
So your partner comes home and they look in the fridge and they don't see the last slice of cake there anymore. And so they ask you, did you eat that last slice of cake? I was hoping to give it to a coworker tomorrow for their birthday. And you completely forgot about this, right? Your partner had mentioned it to you, but just totally slipped your mind. And sure enough, yeah, you ate the last slice of cake when you shouldn't have. And so now you're faced with a decision. Do you tell the truth or do you not tell the truth to your partner? So now you're facing the decision, but of course you're only faced with that decision because you actually ate the last slice of cake. If you hadn't eaten the last slice of cake, there would still be in the fridge, and so your partner wouldn't be asking you where the last slice of cake was. That is, you're faced with this decision about whether to tell the truth or lie. Your being faced with that decision depends on your having eaten the cake. And so the upstream dependence principle implies that at that moment when you're faced with this decision to tell the truth or not, you no longer have a choice about whether you ate the last slice of cake. So whereas the downstream dependence principle says you do have a choice about those things that are downstream or explained by or dependent on your choices, the upstream dependence principle implies that you don't have a choice about those things that brought you to your current decisions or that your current decisions depend on. So they're kind of mirror principles, as it were. And that would explain why Origen was so concerned to point out that our choices don't depend on God's past beliefs, because if they did, well, then the upstream dependence principle would imply that we don't have a choice about what God believed long ago in the past, just as that first premise of the incompatibility argument says. Okay, but now what's so cool and I think really ingenious on Origen's part is once we have that principle, we can actually give a pretty nice response to the grandfather paradox. We can resolve the paradox, as it were. So you're faced with this decision whether to pull the trigger or not. But of course, why are you there? Why are you even faced with that decision to begin with? Well, it's because grandfather survived and he went on to meet grandmother, who went on to give birth to mother, who went on to give birth to you, and you travel back in the past. That is, your being even faced with this decision to begin with depends on grandfather's survival. And so the upstream dependence principle implies that you don't have a choice about the fact that grandfather is going to survive. Now, it's a little bit of an interesting question how the downstream and upstream dependence principles play nicely with each other, because you find they still haven't exactly given us an answer to how the downstream dependence principle avoids the implication that you can kill grandfather.
Right.
I think really what should be said here is either it must be that you don't have a choice about pulling the trigger, that even if you really, really wanted to, you just couldn't bring yourself to do it or something. I think a more plausible response, though, and this comes from folks like Kadri Vivalin and such, is it must be that grandfather's survival doesn't really depend on your pulling the trigger. That even if you were to pull the trigger, you'd slip on a banana peel, or the gun would jam, or a bird would intercept the bullet, or you'd hit grandfather in the shoulder and you think you killed him, but actually he survives. And that's one reason he goes on to become such a terrible person, is because this stranger attacked him in the street, right? It's like, humanity's terrible. I should go commit a bunch of war crimes. So that's but the idea, and there are independent reasons to accept this that we can talk about if you like, but the idea must be that, sure, maybe you have a choice about whether you pull the trigger, but grandfather's survival doesn't really depend on whether you pull the trigger or not. And sure enough, you don't have a choice about grandfather's survival precisely because you're even being faced with the decision to pull the trigger or not depends on grandfather having survived.
That's cool that, even millennia ago, Origen was giving the sort of seeds for a response to the grandfather paradox, which is, only recently discussed. Do you want to say a little bit more about the other time travel case that doesn't involve killing of grandfathers? My case with non-nervousness doesn't involve any killing, thankfully. What do you think about that kind of case?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll give the case, and if you want to, if I misrepresent it in some way, just feel free to correct me. But so let's say you're at the end of your time travel journeys. You had a lot of fun at the Super Bowl. You weren't able to kill grandfather. You went back and you visited with Socrates. You took pictures with velociraptors. You did all kinds of cool stuff. But now you're done. You're ready to head back to the future, back to that moment when your neighbor first knocked on your door and gave you the device to begin with. So you go back, and let's say it's just a couple minutes before your neighbor knocks on the door. So you can you're hiding in the bushes from a safe distance away, right? You don't want to run into her or your former self and, disrupt the space-time continuum or something.
Right.
So you're hiding in the bushes from far away, and you see her. She's walking over toward your door with a contraption in her hands, and you realize something you didn't know, which was that she was really, really struggling over whether to give you the time machine. She's thinking, oh, is this really a good idea? Like, I know he's been down in the dumps for a while, but this would really help them. But what if they do something really stupid? What if they go back and try to kill their own grandfather or something? Like, wow, this is really, really risky business. And so she's really, really struggling with whether or not to give you the time machine. Now, of course, you know what's going to happen. She's eventually going to settle on, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And she's going to go up to the door. She's going to knock on it, and she's going to give her a little spiel, and then walk away. So you're not nervous whatsoever about what's going to happen, despite the fact that it is immensely important to you that she does decide to give your younger self the time machine. Because if she doesn't give your younger self the time machine, then you wouldn't be able to travel to the past and go on all those cool adventures. You wouldn't be in the bushes, waiting from a distance to begin with. So it's very important that she give your younger self the time machine, but you're not nervous that she won't, because you know that she in fact will. But if the dependent solution is right, it seems like she definitely could. It's perfectly possible for her to not give you the time, your younger self, the time machine. And it's because it's really analogous to the case of foreknowledge, right? The idea is your presence there in the bushes doesn't in any way explain or influence your neighbor's decision. We can stipulate that you're far enough away that your older self's presence in the bushes has no causal influence or just no explanatory influence over her decision. You're not making her give your younger self the time machine. Right. And if anything, it's the opposite, right? That her decision to give your younger self the time machine actually explains why you are in the bushes watching from a distance. So it seems very analogous to the case of foreknowledge. And so if the dependent solution says that, well, God's foreknowing that we were going to have this conversation today doesn't undermine our freedom, that we could have decided to not have this conversation, well, then it sure seems like your neighbor could decide to not give your younger self the time machine as well. But that's pretty puzzling. To say both of those things at the same time, the same breath, seems pretty puzzling. Well, on the one hand, you're not nervous whatsoever about the possibility that she's going to not give your younger self the time machine, but she really could do it, right? She's free to do it. It's perfectly within her power to do so. Those two claims side by side seem maybe incompatible, or at least there's a significant tension there, which suggests that there's something wrong with the dependent solution. Does that seem like a fair representation, Taylor?
Yeah, I mean, that's better than I've ever put it. So, yeah, thanks.
Great. I'm glad. So I think it's a really cool case because it forces us to think through this deeper issue of why is the past fixed? Why is the past beyond our control? What's generating the past's fixity? For a number of years, I mean, as Zagzebski talked about, a number of years, people thought about the past as having a certain modal status, completely distinct from the future, and had nothing to do with causation or explanation or anything that I've been talking about. And so I think it really pushes on those kinds of intuitions to figure out where our own views lie. I think the case is really, really interesting. But my response comes in two stages. The first stage is to point out that if we really take the intuition seriously, that she has to give your younger self the time machine, that she's not free to do otherwise, I think we end up in a somewhat mysterious place. And here's how. Think about all of the paradigm cases where someone's freedom has been taken away from them, that they've been constrained in some way. So you're strapped down to the chair, right? And you don't have a knife to break the bonds, or you're behind a locked door and you don't have the key, or maybe you're in a room where the door's unlocked, but there's a really, really big, powerful person waiting to just tackle you if you even look at the door, right? So these are all paradigm cases, I take it, where someone's been constrained in a certain way, and they all have a similar structure. There's some constraining factor, whether it's the straps or the locked door or the really, really large, powerful person, where that factor A, it causally influences, or at least would causally influence your behavior were you to try to do something. So if I were to try to stand up, the straps would, they'd cause me to stay seated. If I were to try to leave the room, either the locked door or the big, large, the bouncer would stop me from leaving. So A, the causal factor has some causal influence, or at least would have some causal influence over my behavior. And B, I don't have any causal influence over the factor itself, or at least the presence of the factor, right? If I had a knife to cut my bonds, to cut the straps, that would be different, right? Then there's something I could do that would get rid of the straps. But as it is, without a knife, without a locked key, without, bigger muscles, it seems like I don't have any kind of causal influence over the constraining factor. So those cases, the paradigm cases, are cases where the constraining factor, A, causally influences, or at least would causally influence your behavior, and B, you have no causal influence over the constraining factor. Well, if we take the nervousness case seriously, we say that your neighbors has to give your younger self the time machine, we end up with a case where the constraining factor has exactly the opposite features. Because presumably the constraining feature is you waiting there in the bushes, knowing exactly what she's going to do. That's the reason she has to give your younger self the time machine, because if she didn't, then the past would be different and blah, blah, blah. So that's the constraining factor. And yet by stipulation, the constraining factor does not have any, it could not have any causal influence over her decision. And B, actually, her decision has causal influence over the factor, right? Over your presence in the bushes. And so it's the exact opposite of the paradigm cases. And so because of that, I think it's kind of strange, right? What I would like, before I kind of fully jump on board here and say, yeah, she has to give your younger self the time machine, I'd like to hear a case that has the same kind of structure as this case, where it seems like the constraining factor is flipped, where it has no causal influence over the agent's behavior, and actually the agent's behavior has causal influence over it, and yet nonetheless we still think of the factor somehow constraining the agent's behavior. And for what it's worth, I haven't been able to think of a case like that, but I think that would be kind of the first step toward me accepting the case, would be coming up with another alternative, independently plausible case that has the same structure. Okay, so that's the first stage of the response. The second stage of the response is to point out that I think there's a pretty plausible error theory for what's gone on here, because it is strange to say that you're not nervous whatsoever about what she's going to do, but she could decide to, go back and not give your younger self the time machine. But the error theory here, I think, is we just need to be a little careful about what we mean by could, what could happen. I think when we talk about what we're nervous about, we're really tracking what sometimes are called epistemic possibilities. What is consistent with our evidence, as it were, or what might happen or could happen given what we know. Whereas when we're talking about what an agent can do, what they're free to do, what they have the power to do, it's not necessarily tracking the same sense of could or might there. So let me just give you an analogy. So I am not nervous whatsoever about the possibility of my parents, making a 4-hour drive over to my apartment, dousing it in gasoline, just burning it to the ground. Not nervous whatsoever about that.
Good.
But I think that, if they really wanted to, I suppose they could, right? I mean, it seems like it is within their power to do so. And so on the one hand, I'm not nervous that they're going to do that, but I acknowledge it is a possibility in some sense that they do it. So how do those two things get along? Well, it's because when I'm talking about what I'm nervous about, I'm really tracking, what is possible given my evidence or given what I know. And given I know the character of my parents and I know our relationship and all that good stuff, I think it's just really, I can rule out the possibility of them coming down and burning down my apartment to the ground. But of course, when I'm talking about what they're free to do, what's in their power to do, that's a different sense of what they could or what they're free to do. I think that, they've got, they've got some gasoline in their garage, and they know how fire works, and they know, where I live, and they've got all the kind of right intrinsic properties and extrinsic properties to make that happen if they really wanted to. And so I think something similar is going on here, right? You're not nervous at all about what your neighbor's going to do, because given your evidence, you can rule out the possibility of her not giving your younger self the time machine. But I think she does have the power to do so, because she's got the right intrinsic and extrinsic properties to where she could, if she really wanted to, it's not like she's forced to give your younger self the time machine. Okay, so that's my response in 2 stages.
Nice.
Cool. What sort of views of divine providence is the dependence response compatible with?
That's a great question. And I think people are still kind of working it out a little bit to some extent. But it's clearly incompatible with some very strong views of providence. So like a theological determinist type view where, from eternity past, God decreed or predetermined everything that ever happens. That's going to be incompatible with freedom, or at least us being free to do otherwise. And the upstream dependence principle is going to get exactly that result. It seems like if, I am part of this conversation only because 1,000 years ago, God decreed that I participate in this conversation. Well, that means I don't have a choice about the fact that God so decreed 1,000 years ago. But God's decrees entail that I have this conversation, and so it's not possible for me to do otherwise, right? So theological determinism is going to be incompatible with the freedom to do otherwise. I think also some people have argued that even Molinist views of freedom are going to be incompatible with the dependence solution. And it's going to be kind of similar to the grandfather paradox, actually. I think this is an interesting result where suppose that God is deciding whether to put Adam or Ben into the garden, say, right? Actualize the words of Adam or Ben in the garden. And he knows via middle knowledge that if he were to put Adam in the garden, he would freely eat of the fruit. Ben also would, but for maybe some ancillary reasons, he has a slight preference that Adam be the one that's in the garden eating the fruit. But what's really important to God is that whoever's in the garden eat the fruit. So he decides to put Adam in the garden, and of course, Adam freely eats the fruit. Well, could he have refrained from eating the fruit? Well, it seems like the upstream dependence principle, again, is going to apply no, that he's not free to refrain, because you think about why is Adam in the garden to begin with? Well, Adam's in the garden to begin with because God placed him there. Why did God place him there? Well, it's because he knew that Adam would freely eat of the fruit. If he had decided to not freely eat of the fruit, then he wouldn't have even placed Adam there to begin with, right? If it weren't true that he would eat of the fruit, God wouldn't have placed him there. He would have placed Ben there instead, we'll say. And so it looks like Adam being in the garden to begin with is dependent on the counterfactual freedom being true and then God placing him there. And so those two facts are, quote, fixed, or he doesn't have a choice about those facts. But of course, given the counterfactual and given God's decision to place him in the garden, that entails that he does eat of the fruit. So it's not possible for him to refrain. It's similar to the grandfather paradox, where the only reason you're even faced with this decision to pull the trigger or not is because grandfather survives. And so you don't have a choice about that. So I think the Molinist view is also going to be incompatible with the dependent solution. And this has led some authors to think that the dependent solution is just a, quote, simple foreknowledge view, where God has foreknowledge of what's going to happen, but it's not providentially useful in any way. It doesn't help God plan for the world, as it were. But I don't think this is right. A number of people have argued like this. So David Hunt and Dean Zimmerman, they have sent some nice papers on this type of problem, where they point out that it sure seems like having foreknowledge kind of in a certain way, you have to structure it just right, but having foreknowledge in just the right way can be providentially useful. So let's go back to the time travel case, for instance. So you know that let's say you're at that stage where you're in the bushes and you're watching your neighbor decide, whether to give you the time machine or not. Of course, she's going to eventually give you the time machine. Let's also suppose you remember now that one of your friends, who is a bit of a loudmouth and, is very active on social media, does lots of stuff, that they're on their way over to visit your younger self. And so if they show up right when your neighbor does and sees the time machine and sees you using it to disappear into the past, right, then this is going to be really bad. There's going to be this huge media frenzy that descends on your neighbor's house, and word about time travel is going to get out, and all kinds of terrible stuff's going to happen. You really want to avoid that result. Well, because you know that she is in fact going to go up to your door and give your younger self the time machine, now what you can do is you pull out your phone from your pocket and you call your friend who's on their way to see your younger self, and you say, hey, sorry, I have to cancel last minute. Please don't come over. I'll see you in a couple days. And then sure enough, you see your friend's car, pull around and make a U-turn and go back to their house. You save the space-time continuum just in time. So it seems like your foreknowledge that your neighbor was going to give you the time machine, it is providentially useful in this sense. It's not really providence because you're not God, but it is useful for helping the future take a certain shape. Thought is it could be very similar with God, where God, he kind of peeks into the certain parts of the future and he sees what's going to happen. Maybe he sees that Adam is going to eat the fruit. And on that basis says, okay, well, now that Adam's going to eat the fruit, I know that's going to happen. What can I do to, help the world? So given that Adam eats the fruit, that the world is still a decent place to live, right? Because eating the fruit is going to cause the fall of humanity and all kinds of terrible things are going to happen. Then what he can do is he can start to put things into motion to help offset the terribleness that Adam's eating the fruit brings, say. So I do think actually that the dependent solution, that's all consistent with a providentially useful foreknowledge. It's not going to be nearly as strong as the Molinist or the theological determinist conception of providence, but it's still somewhat providentially useful.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. Well, thanks so much for your time, Andrew, and for joining us on the podcast. If some of our listeners want to check out more of your work, your papers, or follow what you're working on next, where can they go?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. I had a lot of fun. If you want to learn more about me, feel free to check out my website. If you just Google Andrew Law Philosophy, it should come up. Otherwise, I'll just stop it there. That's it.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll make sure to post a link in the show notes too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks
again for
having me. Yeah,
you're welcome. Thanks for joining us. In the next episode, we talk with Kristen Mickelson about what it means to say that free will and determinism are incompatible with one another.